Photoshop has some very handy grid features, and I'm a huge fan of designing on a grid to draw the viewer's eye to important content on the page. Once you start with an underlying grid, it's far easier to break the rules of the grid than to just design loosely and not have thought in advance about where important content should go. There's a great book written in the 60s by Joseph Mueller-Brockman. The Grid Systems, I think, in Graphic Design is the title, and it's gospel for me. It applied to the print world, and now we've carried that into the web and device and mobile world. So without further ado, let's go to View, Show, Grid. And with the grid on, it's very overwhelming to start. So what we're going to do is I want to start with an 8-column grid, where ideally we may only use 4 of those 8 columns or 6 of those 8 columns. I can still intelligently place content by working within the confines of those columns. So on Windows, this will be under Edit, Preferences, and Guides, Grid, and Slices. On the Mac, Photoshop, Preferences, Guides, Grid, and Slices. And I'm going to do a grid line every 15%. And when I choose 15%, you could see the main divisions here. And that's only 7. So if I go down to 10%, you get 10. So you see the story. When I'm doing images, I often do grid line every 50%. And if I put subdivisions to 1 and scoot this over and zoom out, on every photo I could see dead center of the image, so I can crop from center out, I can align from center out. But let's adjust this so we get 8 columns. And a lot of templates in Dreamweaver start this way, and they tier down content to be responsive, to reflow on smaller screen sizes so your site looks best for the screen it lands on. So this grid is important to keep in mind when you start with desktop website development and then do mock-ups to deliver to the different sizes that are on mobile. So really absorb this grid principle if you didn't learn about it when you were studying to be a graphic designer or an artist. All right, so to get 8 grid lines, I'm going to do 12.5%. And I got 8 grid lines. And I might want smaller subdivisions to create regions within those 8. So I could do a subdivision of 2 and I get lighter lines, or possibly 3. I'm going to see how it impacts my layout in the background. I find 3 too busy, so I'll stick with 2 and just loosely use the regions in the grid to call the viewer's eye to important content on the page. So when you click OK, I'm going to zoom in with Command plus or Control plus and wheel up. And you'll notice that Products is really starting at my first subdivision on the grid line. I'm going to go to Cart, which is the last piece, and I'm going to put it at about the same distance. So we've got one whole grid row here. I'm going to place Cart to that grid intersection. So farthest right, farthest left. Now before I balance the others in between, there's a logo that I want to place. And I'm going to click on the word Products so that when I place it, it will go above Products in my Layers panel. So File, Place, and I will grab the Pluralist, I love that name for a fictitious company, logo. And it's an AI file, Native Illustrator. So when I hit Place, it shows me a preview of this, and I could select Bounding Box, but I might want to choose Art Box. Art Box is just a live art. Often they're the same, but Illustrator files, where there's white space on the page, it's not real content. Only the bottom of the P to the top of the letter E, the top right corner of where that intersects, is the live art area. When I click OK, it will create a smart object. and it might have done that way down in the middle of my page. Smart Objects embed the Illustrator file inside this Photoshop document. That means if I decide to add color to that logo, I can double-click it, it will launch Illustrator and open that file. So there it is, it put it in the center of my screen, not below on the page. I'll drag it up and it's perfectly snapping to this grid line. So I will nudge with my arrow keys until I'm happy, then press Return or Enter to accept it. And I could continue to nudge up or down, but I often use Edit, Free Transform so that I snap two grid lines. And you may need to check, there it is. You could feel the snapping as you move it around. Return or Enter accepts it, and this is the icon, meaning it fully stored the editable vector Illustrator file in Photoshop so I could make edits to the shape, the color in Illustrator. But let's finish with the last two. Adventure Sports, I'm going to move over and align to the second grid line. Join or log in, I'll move over to this grid line. So giving the pluralist a little bit more visual space on both sides. So I've got 1, 2, really about 2 spaces because of the width of the word product in my grid between that and Adventure Sports. Really about 2 here, about 2 there, and I'm counting like this is half, so a little bit more. So I'm pretty consistent. I probably have a little extra space in these two because the word cart is so small, but it's going to get a little icon for a cart next to it. So the last thing I'm going to do is select Products, Shift-click on Cart, and align either the top or bottom edges so I make sure that nothing is moved up or down. They're all aligned perfectly. With them selected, I may nudge them down a little bit closer to the image. And there, I've used an overall grid in my document to align elements and position them to finish my nav bar. So the grid is under Edit, Preferences, Guides, Grid, and Slices, or on the Mac, Photoshop, Preferences, Guides, Grid, and Slices. And I find a lot of people don't know you can divide it into percentages. And subdivisions I often set to 1 or 2. I find more than 2 to be distracting, but I know some people who like 4 or 6. Everyone has their own habits. So I'll click OK, and hopefully you can find a grid space that works for your layouts and use it to put elements of your design in thoughtful places, starting with a grid.